The forest was not silent tonight. It was alive with the sound of pursuit. Alara's bare feet pounded against the wet earth, splashing through mud and shallow pools, each step jarring her bones, each gasp of air burning her lungs. The storm had been building all evening, and now the sky was split open, releasing a cold, hard rain that cut against her skin like tiny blades. The night clung to her, wrapping her in a suffocating blackness broken only by the pale flashes of lightning. The trees rose on either side like twisted giants, their branches clawing at her arms and catching in her tangled hair. She didn't stop to free herself when they snagged, she tore forward, the pain of splintered twigs scratching her flesh nothing compared to the danger behind her. Her thigh throbbed where a deep gash bled freely, sticky warmth mixing with the rain as it trickled down her leg. She didn't know when she'd been cut. Maybe when she'd vaulted that fallen log, maybe when she'd slipped on the moss-covered stones, but she knew it was slowing her. Every step made the wound scream, and her body screamed back at it, not yet. Not now. Keep moving. And still, over the roar of the storm, she could hear them. Footsteps. Heavy. Determined. And snarls, low, guttural, too close. They weren't just wolves tonight. The sound was wrong, wet breath, boots slamming through puddles, voices muttering in human tongues. They were both. Men who could shift at will. Hunters. Her hunters. Her pulse was so loud in her ears it felt like her own body was trying to drown her in the sound of her fear. She ducked low under a branch, nearly slipping on the mud, heart punching against her ribs, and that was when she heard it, the voice. Alara. A single word. Her name. Ripped through the night with a venom that froze her mid-stride. It wasn't the voice of a stranger. No, this voice knew her. It had known her since childhood. It had whispered threats in training yards, muttered insults in passing, laughed with the others when her mother's sharp tongue cut her down in front of the pack. A memory rose, unbidden, her mother's cold, perfect face leaning close, the words slipping out like a poison blade, "No alpha will ever want you. You're too soft. Too big. Too slow." The icy wind seemed to repeat it now, slicing into her from every side. She stumbled, breath breaking in her throat, and for a single heartbeat, she wanted to stop. She wanted to curl into the wet earth, let the cold swallow her, let them take her and end it all. But she didn't. Instead, she threw herself forward, forcing her legs to keep moving, her bare soles slapping through the puddles until she spotted it, a hollow oak, its wide trunk gaping like an open mouth. She dove inside, curling her body against the damp, rotting wood, pressing a trembling hand over her mouth to quiet her breaths. The rain was deafening here. It hammered the canopy overhead, dripped down her neck in icy rivulets, and each drop carried the taste of iron and earth. She leaned her head back, eyes squeezed shut, listening for them. The footsteps drew closer. The snarl sharpened. One of them laughed, low and mean. She can't be far. The scent's too fresh. Her muscles ached from holding still. Every instinct screamed at her to run again, but she knew, if she moved now, they'd hear. And if they heard, it was over. Her heart pounded so hard she was sure they could track it like a drumbeat in the dark. And then it happened. She exhaled, just a small breath, and the air around her frosted. White mist curled from her lips, coiling like a living thing in the cold night. She blinked, confusion knotting in her chest. The rain that slipped through the branches above, changed. Where it struck her skin, it shimmered faintly, a silvery glow in the darkness. Her breath caught. It had happened before, once, when she was young. She had thought it was a trick of the moonlight. She had told no one. But now, here it was again, and she knew, deep down, it was not normal. A twig snapped. She froze. The glow faded, the silver mist dissipating into the storm. Alara, her name again. Closer this time. Her eyes darted through the hollow, searching for escape. But there was none, not without being seen. And then the voice changed. It was no longer the voice of someone she hated. It was a different voice, lower, darker, wrapped in a strange kind of authority that pulled at her gut. "I can see you." Her breath hitched. She couldn't move. Couldn't even turn to look. She knew without seeing that whoever stood outside wasn't one of them, not entirely. The air felt different. Heavy. Electric. The footsteps stopped right outside the hollow. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the voice said, softer now, almost curious, "You're hurt." She didn't know why, but those words rattled her more than the threats had. The storm raged on, but it felt far away now. The only sound that mattered was the slow, deliberate inhale of the man standing just beyond her hiding place. "Alara," he said again, and this time, it wasn't a question. It was a claim. "If your heart is already racing, subscribe to the Alpha's Romance Library. Because here, danger is only the beginning." The rain shifted. It was subtle at first, a change in the rhythm, as though the storm itself had paused to listen. Alara's pulse stuttered in her throat. She could still hear the voices of the hunters, their steps circling through the trees, but beneath that, something else. A low rumble. It wasn't thunder. It was closer. More primal. The kind of sound that vibrated through bone rather than air. Her gaze flicked toward the darkness beyond the hollow, and then the forest exploded. A blur of shadow slammed through the undergrowth, the shape too big, too fast, too deliberate to be anything but deadly. The first hunter didn't even have time to cry out. One moment he was there, crouched and sniffing the air, the next, he was gone, dragged into the black with a scream that cut off too quickly. The others reacted instantly, shifting mid-movement, their bones snapping and fur tearing through skin. Wolf shapes launched into the clearing, teeth bared, eyes flashing in the stormlight. The thing that hit them was larger than any of them, broad shoulders covered in sleek black fur, muscles rippling under the onslaught of rain. And his eyes, gods, his eyes were silver. Not pale like moonlight, but molten, like liquid metal poured into the sockets of a beast. The air filled with snarls, yelps, and the sharp crack of impact as the massive wolf tore into them with terrifying precision. There was no hesitation in his movements, no wasted energy, just clean, brutal efficiency. Alara couldn't look away. She knew she should run, take advantage of the chaos, but her body refused to obey. The black wolf dispatched the last of them with a vicious twist of his head, sending the enemy sprawling into the mud, unconscious. And then, without a sound, the wolf turned to face her. It was like being caught in the gaze of a storm. Those silver eyes locked on her, unblinking, unrelenting. The world held its breath. And then he shifted. It was not the messy, bone-snapping process she had seen before in others. His change was fluid, almost luminous, as if the rain itself bent away from his skin to grant him passage between forms. In the space of a heartbeat, the wolf was gone, and in its place stood a man. He was tall, the kind of tall that made the trees seem less imposing. Black hair, rain-slicked and falling in uneven strands around a face built from sharp lines and unspoken challenges. His body was all lean muscle, honed for strength rather than show, and the storm clung to him as though reluctant to let go. But it was his eyes that rooted her in place. They were still silver. Still molten. Still unyielding. Alara. He said her name as if he'd been holding it for a long time. Not questioning. Not confirming. Stating. Her breath caught. Who, why were they chasing you? His voice was low, but it carried the weight of command. The kind that demanded answers without giving space for lies. She blinked, rain dripping from her lashes. I, and the rain. His gaze sharpened. How did you make it stop? Her stomach turned. I didn't, his head tilted, eyes narrowing slightly, as though her words were a puzzle piece that refused to fit. You did something. I didn't do anything, she said, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. His attention flicked to her thigh, where the gash had begun to clot under the mix of blood and rain. He took a step forward. She flinched back. I'm not going to hurt you, he said, but there was something in his tone that made the promise sound less like reassurance and more like an inevitability. She swallowed hard. That's what people say before they hurt you. For a moment, they stood in the rain, the storm pressing around them like a cage. You've heard of me, he said finally. She hesitated. Cale Dorian. A flicker of something passed through his expression, recognition, perhaps, or something heavier. Then you know I could have let them take you. Her pulse jumped. Why didn't you? His gaze didn't waver. I'm still deciding. The words should have terrified her. They did, in a way. But there was something else there too, threading through her fear, an ache, a pull she didn't understand and didn't want to. He stepped closer, closing the space between them until the heat of his body cut through the cold rain. You're bleeding, he murmured. I'll live. He reached out, slow enough that she could have moved away, but she didn't. His hand closed around her arm, not tight, not threatening, but steady. The moment his skin touched hers, heat flared. Not just warmth from contact, but something deeper, older, as though his touch had found some buried ember inside her and coaxed it back to life. Her breath stuttered. His eyes darkened. You feel it too, he said, and it wasn't a question. She didn't answer. She couldn't. The rain eased around them, not stopping entirely, but softening, as if the storm itself had bent closer to listen. He let go of her arm, though the echo of his touch lingered like a brand. You should come with me. She shook her head. I don't go with strangers. A faint, almost dangerous smile touched his mouth. I'm not a stranger. Her pulse kicked harder. And for the first time since she'd started running, Alara wondered if she was safer with him, or in the hands of the wolves she'd been fleeing. The rain had softened to a mist now, drifting between the trees and ghostly ribbons, as if the forest itself had grown curious about the two figures standing there. Cale's silver gaze hadn't moved from her face. It wasn't the hard, assessing stare of a predator anymore, it was sharper in a different way, cutting beneath the surface, digging for something she had buried long ago. Alara shifted her weight, feeling the wet ground suck at her bare feet. You don't get to look at me like that. His brows lifted slightly. Like what? Like you know me. A muscle in his jaw twitched, but he didn't reply. And that silence, that quiet confidence in not answering, was more unnerving than anything he could have said. She turned away, scanning the darkness between the trees. She didn't need his questions stirring the things she'd spent years burying. But the moment she looked into that mist, memories began to uncoil. It started, as it always did, with her mother's voice. Stand up straight, Alara. At least try to look like you belong here. She'd been 15, standing among the daughters of high-ranking wolves during the midsummer gathering. They'd all been tall, lean, graceful, eyes bright, laughter light. And then there was her. Broad-shouldered, hips full, hair a wild mess no matter how tightly she tried to braid it. When she'd reached for a honey cake from the table, her mother's hand had shot out, nails biting into her wrist. Enough. You're all ready. The pause had been deliberate, the final word a quiet blade slipped between ribs. Enough. The other girls had smirked behind their goblets, whispering just loud enough for her to hear. Too soft. Too big. Not alpha material. That was the first time she'd realized she wasn't just an outsider in spirit, her body itself was a mark against her. Cale's voice cut through the memory. You've been running a long time. She didn't answer. Her eyes stayed fixed on the trees, but her chest felt tight, her breath shallow. The next memory came without her consent. The training yard. Cold wind snapping at her face. The sting of her palms on packed dirt. She'd been sparring with Joran, the son of her mother's closest ally. He'd come at her hard, faster than the instructors allowed, his fists more punishment than practice. She'd taken hit after hit, until something inside her had cracked, not bone, but something deeper. The next moment was a blur of heat and silver light. Her vision had gone strange, the world sharpening, every sound ringing like it was part of a battle hymn. And then Joran was on the ground, gasping, clawing at his own throat as though it burned. She'd stared at her hands, at the faint tendrils of silver mist curling from her skin. The instructors had frozen. The other trainees had backed away. And her mother had looked at her not with concern, but with something colder. Calculation. That night, the council called it an incident. They said she had an unstable gift, a dangerous bloodline. They called it moonfire. She'd heard the word before. It was a name from the old stories, a clan wiped out centuries ago, their power too wild, too destructive to be allowed to live. And she was descended from them. They didn't exile her outright, not officially. That would have been too public. Instead, they made her life unlivable. Doors closed to her. Invitations revoked. The pack's healer refused to treat her injuries after training. Even the children stared like she was some dark omen. She left before the year was out. Kale's voice pulled her back again. You've got the look of someone who's been hunted by more than just wolves. Her head snapped toward him. I don't want your pity. I didn't offer any. His tone was flat, but there was something in his eyes, a depth she couldn't read, not fully. It wasn't softness. It wasn't sympathy. It was recognition. That unsettled her more than pity ever could. She crossed her arms, though the gesture felt more like a shield than defiance. You don't know what I've been through. Maybe not the details, he said, taking a slow step closer, but I know the look of someone who's been told they don't belong. And I know the sound a person makes when they've stopped believing they deserve more. Her breath caught. The words hit with a precision that felt almost unfair. The rain had dwindled to nothing now. The forest smelled of wet earth and pine, sharp and clean. She could hear her own heartbeat in the stillness. I don't need saving, she said finally. Kale's mouth curved, not in amusement, but in something sharper. Good. I'm not here to save you. Her gaze narrowed. Then why are you here? His answer came without hesitation. Because the last time a moonfire was seen in these woods, an entire pack vanished before dawn. And you just breathed silver mist into the air. Her skin prickled. So you think I'm dangerous? He held her gaze for a long, steady beat. I think you're exactly what they're afraid of. Something inside her shifted at that, not the fear she expected, but a flicker of heat, low and dangerous. And for the first time since she'd left her old pack, Alara wondered if maybe, she was. The forest deepened as they walked. Kale said little, his long strides forcing Alara to keep pace, though every step felt like it was carrying her further into something she couldn't name. The air grew heavier, not with the weight of danger but with a kind of reverence, the way the world feels when you're standing somewhere it doesn't want to be disturbed. It was quiet here. Too quiet. No rustle of leaves. No call of night birds. Only the soft rhythm of rain dripping from branch to branch. The trees thinned, opening into a clearing bathed in silver light. The clouds had broken above, letting the moon pour itself onto the earth like molten glass. The ground was covered in pale moss, so soft it muted their footsteps, and in the center of the clearing was a pool. The water glowed, not a reflection, not just moonlight playing tricks, but an inner radiance, as if the pool was holding its own piece of the night sky. Around it stood 12 stone wolves, each carved in a different pose. Some snarling, some watchful, some looking skyward with their jaws open as though howling. Their eyes, though made of unyielding stone, seemed to follow her. Alara stopped at the edge of the clearing. What is this place? Kale didn't look at her when he answered. Sacred ground. Older than any living alpha. Older than the packs themselves. She took a step forward, drawn despite herself. The air here hummed faintly, a vibration she felt in her teeth, her bones. She knew, without knowing how, that whatever this was, it had been waiting a very long time. This is where it began, Kale said, finally looking at her. where the first pact between wolves and moon was made. Her gaze flicked to the statues. And those? Guardians, he said. They watch. They remember. They judge. Alara felt a shiver trace her spine. She wasn't sure if it was the cool air or the weight of those unseen eyes. Kale moved to the pool's edge, motioning for her to follow. Come. Look. She hesitated. Why? Because it's time you saw yourself. There was something in his voice that made her stomach tighten, something that wasn't command, wasn't plea, but sat uneasily between them. Against her better judgment, she stepped forward until she could see her reflection in the water. It should have been simple. Her face, pale in the moonlight. Her dark hair plastered to her head from the rain. The faint streak of dried blood along her temple. But it wasn't simple. Because the water was shifting. Her reflection's eyes weren't their usual hazel, they were burning silver, as if someone had poured molten light into them. And her hair, strands of it shimmered like threads of fire, silver and white and alive. She staggered back. What is that? The truth, Kale said quietly. She shook her head. No. That's not me. It is. And it's why they're afraid of you. Her pulse was hammering. She wanted to run, to scrub the image from her mind, to pretend she'd never seen it. I don't want this. I never asked for it. You think the moon asks permission before it rises? Her gaze snapped to his. I'm not some chosen one in a story. I'm not, the flame bearer? His voice was sharp now, cutting through her denial. The one the legends speak of? Marked by the moon. Born to either unite the packs, or burn them all? She laughed, but it was hollow. Then they should have picked someone else. Someone who wants it. They didn't pick wrong. His tone was steady, but his eyes, those molten silver eyes, held something fierce. She looked away, back at the pool, but the reflection was gone now. Just her face again, tired and weary and far too human. What if I destroy everything, she whispered. Kale's answer came without hesitation. What if you save it? The clearing seemed to lean closer, the statues watching, the pool glowing as if holding its breath. And somewhere deep inside her, a spark she had been trying to smother for years flickered in the dark. The moonlit grove faded behind them, its strange stillness replaced by the pulse of wind through the trees. Kale walked ahead, silent but purposeful, his presence cutting a path as though the forest itself made room for him. Alara followed, her mind still tangled in the reflection she'd seen. Silver fire in her hair, light in her eyes. It was easier to watch the way his shoulders moved under his coat than to think about what it meant. They reached the edge of the forest, and sound hit her like a wave. Voices. Many voices. The rhythmic beat of a drum. The flare of torchlight licking up into the night. Kale stopped without turning. Stay close. And whatever happens, don't react unless I tell you to. She opened her mouth to ask what he meant, but then they stepped into the clearing, and the question burned away. Dozens of wolves, some in human form, some shifted, stood in a wide circle. The air was thick with the scent of wet fur, smoke, and tension sharp enough to draw blood. At the center, a raised platform held a stone table carved with old sigils. Every head turned when Kale entered, and then every gaze slid past him, to her. It was like walking into a pit of knives. A murmur ran through the crowd, low and vicious. She caught pieces of it, witch, outsider, dangerous. Someone spat in the dirt. A man stepped forward from the opposite side of the circle. His hair was silver, not from age but from some wolf-born quirk, and his eyes were as cold as river ice. He wore authority like a weapon. Kale, he said, his voice carrying without effort. You bring a problem into our gathering. She's not your concern, Riven, Kale replied evenly. She's everyone's concern, Riven shot back. His gaze cut to Alara, raking over her like she was something scraped from the bottom of a boot. The moonfire curse is not welcome here. A ripple of agreement moved through the crowd. Alara kept her chin up, but every instinct screamed at her to get out. To vanish before this turned into something she couldn't walk away from. Riven's smile was thin and cruel. Tell me, girl, do you think hiding behind an alpha will save you? Or will he tire of you like the others did? Her stomach tightened. She didn't want to ask, but she already knew where this was going. And then he said it. The words that had shadowed her since she was a child. Too fat to be chosen. It was quiet for half a heartbeat, and then laughter broke over the gathering like a crack of thunder. Sharp, ugly, the kind that wasn't just meant to wound, it was meant to break. Kale's jaw tightened. His hands flexed at his sides. Riven saw it and leaned into the cruelty. What's the matter, Alpha? Can't find a mate worthy of your title? Or are you taking pity on strays now? The crowd roared with more laughter, some turning away, others watching eagerly for Kale's reaction. Alara's skin burned. Not from shame, no, not anymore, but from the way their eyes drank her in like she was nothing more than a target for sport. She wanted to shout, to call down the silver fire and make them swallow their own words. But Kale's warning rang in her ears, don't react unless I tell you to. Still, she saw the war in his eyes. If he defended her here, before all of them, he'd be declaring himself openly on her side. And in this crowd, that would be more than just defiance, it would be a declaration of war. He looked at her, just once, and she saw the choice tearing him apart. His duty to his pack. His instinct to protect her. The knowledge that if he stepped in now, there would be no going back. And she knew, in that moment, that she couldn't let him choose. She stepped back. Then another. The crowd shifted, sensing movement. Alara, Kale's voice cut through, warning, but she kept going. Don't, she said, her voice low but steady. Don't fight this for me. I'm not your problem. His eyes flashed, silver hardening into steel. You are. But she was already at the edge of the circle. Not for long. And then she turned and walked into the night, past the torches and the laughter, past the weight of 100 judging stares, until the forest swallowed her again. She didn't run. Not this time. But each step away from him felt like tearing out a piece of herself she hadn't even realized she'd given. The forest swallowed her whole. She let it. The darkness was easier than torchlight, easier than the sneering faces and the weight of Kale's gaze locked on hers. Easier than waiting for him to choose between her and everything he'd sworn to protect. She didn't know if she could have stood there and watched him decide. She didn't want to find out. The night air was colder away from the gathering. It bit at her cheeks, slid icy fingers down the back of her neck. She kept walking, deeper and higher into the mountains, following the sound of rushing water until the voices were gone and the only thing left was the drumbeat of her own heart. By the time she found the cave, her body ached with exhaustion. It was narrow at the entrance, a jagged tear in the rock, but inside it opened into a wide chamber. The air smelled faintly of earth and old ash. A stream trickled along one wall, its surface silver in the moonlight spilling through a crack in the ceiling. She sank against the wall, pulling her knees to her chest. The gash in her thigh throbbed with every shift of her muscles. She pressed her palm to it, willing herself to ignore the sting, to ignore everything. It was quiet enough that she almost missed the sound. Boots on stone. Steady. Unhurried. Her head snapped up. Kale emerged from the shadows of the entrance as though the night had delivered him here on purpose. His coat was damp from the mist, his hair pushed back from his face, but his eyes were the same molten silver they'd been under the torches. He carried something wrapped in cloth under one arm. You walk like someone who wants to be followed, he said. She glared. Or maybe I walk like someone who wants to be left alone. He didn't flinch. Didn't slow. Just stepped inside and crouched near the small pit of ash in the center of the chamber. With a flick of his wrist, a flame bloomed, small at first, then catching on the scraps of old wood as if it had been waiting for him. He unwrapped the bundle. Bread. Smoked meat. A flask of water. He set them on a flat rock between them. Eat. She didn't move. Why are you here? He didn't look up from the fire. Because you left bleeding. And because I'm not in the habit of letting people I've saved die in a cave. I didn't ask you to save me, she said. Doesn't matter. She stared at him, at the way the firelight caught in his hair, casting half his face in shadow. You could have defended me back there. His jaw tightened. I could have started a war back there. And I'm not worth that risk, she said, the words sharper than she meant. His gaze lifted to hers then, steady and unflinching. That's not what I said. The silence between them stretched, thick and alive. The fire cracked softly, the stream whispered along the rock, but the real current hummed in the space between their bodies. Finally, she reached for the bread. She ate slowly, more to have something to do with her hands than out of hunger. Cale leaned back against the wall, watching the flames. Do you think I've never been humiliated in front of my own kind? She almost laughed, but there was nothing funny in his tone. You're Cale Dorian. You walk into a room and people look away. That's not respect, he said. That's fear. And fear will bow to you in public, then drive a knife between your ribs in private. Something in his voice shifted, quieter now, the edges softened. I've had packmates I grew up with turn on me. People I trusted since childhood sell my name to enemies for a few pieces of silver. And every time, I swore I wouldn't let it cut me again. But it always does. Alara's fingers stilled on the bread. She didn't know what she'd expected him to say, orders, threats, maybe even pity, but not this. I didn't want you there tonight, he went on, because I knew what they'd do. And I knew you'd look at me the way you did when you walked away, like I'd already failed you. Her throat tightened. You think too much of yourself if you believe I expect anything from you. He leaned forward then, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on her like he could strip away every lie she tried to wrap herself in. You expect nothing because expecting has never worked out for you. And maybe you're right to keep it that way. But I'm not them. The words hit somewhere deep, where the walls she'd built weren't as solid as she thought. She looked away first, toward the stream, watching the moonlight ripple on its surface. When she felt him move closer, she didn't stop him. He reached for her thigh, his fingers brushing lightly over the torn fabric. She flinched, not from pain, but from the heat of his touch. Let me see, he said. She hesitated, then shifted so the firelight fell across the wound. He cleaned it with water from the flask, his touch firm but careful. When he bound it with a strip torn from his own shirt, she noticed the small scar along his wrist, a thin white line that vanished under his sleeve. What happened there? She asked before she could stop herself. He glanced at it, then back at her. An old fight. I lost more than I won that day. Something in the way he said it made her wonder what, or who, he'd lost. But she didn't ask. When he finished, they stayed like that for a while, the fire warming the space between them, the night pressing close beyond the cave's mouth. Her gaze drifted to his face, the way the light turned the silver in his eyes into liquid metal. She didn't know when she'd leaned forward, only that she was close enough to feel his breath on her lips. Cale didn't move. Didn't pull her closer. Didn't push her away. He just stayed there, letting the choice be hers. Her heart thundered in her chest. She could kiss him. She wanted to. The heat in his eyes told her he wanted it too. But then the memory of the gathering slammed back into her, the laughter, the words, the way she'd walked away before he could decide. The truth was, she didn't know if she could survive being let down by him. She pulled back. Cale's expression didn't change, but something in the air between them cooled. She settled against the wall, her voice low. You should sleep. We have a long walk ahead. He didn't argue. But when he lay down on the opposite side of the fire, she could feel his eyes on her long after she'd closed hers. And she wondered, for the first time, if she'd just stepped away from something she might never get back. the dawn came cold and thin. Alara woke to the sound of voices outside the cave, low, urgent, and far too close. Cale was already on his feet, moving toward the entrance with the silent readiness of a man who never truly slept. She pushed herself upright, muscles stiff, her thigh a dull throb beneath the makeshift bandage. "What is it?" He didn't answer immediately, only glanced back at her with that look she'd come to recognize, half warning, half calculation. Then he stepped outside. The morning mist clung to the ground like a second skin. 3 men waited there, their cloaks marked with the black sigil of the Crescent Fong Council. Their expressions were grave, their eyes flicking between Cale and the shadowed mouth of the cave where Alara stood. One stepped forward, a narrow-faced wolf with a voice like dry bark. "It's worse than we thought, Alpha." Cale's tone was clipped. "Say it." The man hesitated, then glanced deliberately toward Alara before speaking. "The council has spoken. A prophecy has been uncovered, one that names the Moonfire as the destroyer of all packs. If she remains free, the blood of our people will be on your hands." Alara's stomach turned to stone. Cale's jaw worked, but his voice stayed calm. "Prophecies are often twisted to serve the teller." The man's lips curved in something like pity. "This one is clear. She burns the bridges between packs. She lights the pyre that ends us all." "Who told you this?" Cale asked. Another stepped forward, broad-shouldered, eyes like frost. "Counselor Varric. He claims the text came from the archives, older than the first alphas." Alara stepped out of the cave now, the damp air sharp in her lungs. "That's a lie." "I've never..." "Quiet," the frost-eyed man snapped, his hand twitching toward the hilt at his belt. Cale's gaze cut to him like a blade, and the man stilled instantly. But when Cale looked back at her, something in his eyes had shifted. She saw it, just a flicker, but enough. Doubt. She felt it like a knife between her ribs. "This is exactly what they want," she said, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and something far more dangerous, hurt. "They want you to see me the way they do. As a threat." Cale didn't answer right away. He turned back to the council wolves, his voice low. "What do they want?" "She must be contained," the narrow-faced one said. "For everyone's safety." Contained. The word tasted like chains. Cale's hands curled into fists at his sides. He didn't look at her when he spoke next. "Until I verify the truth of this prophecy, she will remain under guard." The air left her lungs in a rush. "You're putting me in a cage for a story you haven't even proven?" His gaze finally met hers. There was no malice there, but no softness either. "I'm keeping you alive." "No," she said, her voice sharp. "You're keeping them comfortable." The mist seemed to thicken between them, every breath heavy with the things they weren't saying. "You don't understand how quickly fear turns to bloodshed," he said. "And you don't understand what it feels like to be the one everyone fears," she shot back. "Or maybe you do, and that's why this hurts more." The council wolves moved in, circling her without touching. Cale didn't stop them. That was the breaking point. The air around her shifted. It started in her chest, a heat, small at first, then growing, pressing against her ribs until it felt like it would crack her open. Her breath came out in a plume of silver mist, curling through the morning like smoke from a dying fire. The nearest wolf stumbled back, eyes wide. "Alara," Cale said sharply, stepping forward, but it was too late. The heat surged into her hands, and silver fire licked across her skin, bright enough to throw their shadows long against the cave wall. She didn't strike. She didn't need to. The sight alone was enough to send the council wolves stumbling away, their bravado melting into fear. Her gaze stayed locked on Cale. "You could have trusted me." Then she turned, the silver flame burning a path into the mist as she disappeared into the trees. He didn't follow. Not yet. The night of the eclipse came heavy with the taste of iron in the air. The mountain plateau was lit by fire and shadow, the torches of the assembled packs throwing jagged light across a sea of armed wolves and men. At the center of it all, beneath the bleeding arc of the half-hidden moon, stood Kale. Bound. Chains of black steel coiled around his wrists and shoulders, the links humming faintly with the low magic that could hold even the strongest alpha. His head was bowed, silver eyes dulled, but every inch of his stance radiated defiance. The rival alphas had come together in a rare, poisonous unity. Riven stood at their front, voice carrying over the wind as he addressed the crowd. Tonight, we end the crescent fawn line before the moon chooses a side. Tonight, the prophecy dies with him. The wind shifted. The smell of storm rolled down from the peaks. Somewhere beyond the ring of enemy wolves, the forest shuddered. And then, heat. It moved like a living thing, racing over the ground, curling through the grass, swallowing the shadows between the torches. The flames weren't the red-orange of a normal fire, they were silver, sharp enough to burn the eyes. Gasps broke through the crowd. The silver fire split open, and she stepped through. Elara. Her hair whipped in the wind, strands catching the firelight like molten threads. Her eyes were pure moonlight, her skin alive with the glow of power that pulsed just under the surface. Every step she took toward the circle sent the flames curling higher. The chains around Kale groaned, the magic in them flickering as her power filled the air. Riven snarled. You've come to watch him die, witch? Or to burn with him? She didn't answer with words. The fire surged from her hands, climbing her arms, wrapping her like an embrace. Her body shimmered, the edges of her form blurring into light, and then bones shifted, skin split, muscle reshaped. The silver wolf landed on the stone with a sound that shook the air. She was massive, towering over the nearest wolves, her fur a flowing river of moonlit silver, her eyes a mirror of the glowing sky. The ground steamed where her paws touched, the earth itself bending away from her heat. Her howl tore from her throat and up into the black, a sound so raw and commanding that the clouds above shuddered apart, revealing the full face of the eclipse. And as the moonlight struck her, it turned silver. The gasp that rolled through the gathered wolves was almost physical. Every alpha there felt it in their bones, the mark of the moonfire wasn't a curse. It was sovereignty. The black steel chains around Kale shattered like glass. He looked up at her, and for the first time, the steel in his gaze cracked into something else, something that almost looked like awe. But the air shifted again. A shadow peeled itself away from the stone dais behind Riven. Tall, gaunt, eyes like frozen suns. Impressive, the figure said, voice old enough to carry centuries of dust. But power without control is just another weapon to be turned. Alara's hackles rose. She knew him, not by face, but by the weight of his presence. This was no mere alpha. This was the hand behind the prophecy. The architect of her exile. Derek, Kale growled, his voice like stone breaking. The ancient alpha smiled without warmth. You were always too soft, Kale. Too willing to believe the best in the wrong people. This one, he nodded toward Alara, was born to burn. I simply made sure the spark caught in the right place. The crowd shifted, uneasy. Wolves glanced at one another, the unity between them starting to fray under the weight of his words. Alara took a step forward, her silver fire spilling from her fur, running in rivers across the ground until it circled Varric. The heat was enough to make the torches bend away, their flames thinning. You forged a prophecy, she said, her voice carrying in both mind and air, the way only the most ancient bloodlines could speak. You used it to pit us against each other, to keep the packs weak. And you thought you could keep me afraid long enough to finish what you started. Varric's smile faltered. Her power swelled again, a tidal pull inside her chest, and she no longer tried to hold it back. The silver fire burst upward, a pillar of light that reached the newly bared moon, the two forces meeting in a blinding flash. When the light faded, Alara stood not as a wolf, not as a woman, but something in between. A creature of both forms, silver fire threading through her hair, her eyes like the heart of the eclipse itself. This ends tonight, she said. Varric's answer was a roar, his body breaking into the monstrous shape of a shadow wolf taller than any alpha present. The crowd scattered back, the air splitting with the force of their clash as Alara met him in the center of the plateau. And somewhere in that chaos, Kale moved, free, armed, and ready to make sure she didn't stand alone. The prophecy wasn't going to kill the packs. It was going to change them forever. The plateau stank of smoke and blood. The rival wolves had scattered, their unity shattered in the blinding heat of Alara's power. Some had fled into the tree-line, their shapes disappearing into the black. Others lay on the stone, groaning, nursing burns that shimmered faintly with silver light. The flames she had unleashed were gone now, but their afterimage still lingered in every eye that had dared to look at her. She stood in the center of it all, chest rising and falling, her hair tangled with ash, her bare feet blackened from the scorched ground. The moon hung whole and heavy above her, its silver face watching in silence. Derek was gone, not destroyed, not truly. Only driven back into the shadows from which he'd crawled. She could still feel his presence like a thorn in her thoughts, promising they would meet again. Kale came to her slowly, his steps cautious, as though approaching a creature that might vanish, or bite, if he moved too fast. He stopped close enough that she could see the cut above his brow, the blood drying into a dark line. "You changed everything tonight," he said, voice low. Her eyes stayed on the moon. "I don't know if that's a good thing." "It's the only thing," he replied. She turned to face him, and for a moment, the space between them felt like the only part of the world that hadn't burned. His gaze was steady, but there was something in it she couldn't quite name, pride, maybe. Or fear. "You saw what I am," she said. "I saw who you are. Do you believe me now?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. Then, softer, "The question is, do you believe yourself?" She didn't answer. Around them, the surviving wolves kept their distance, whispering. She could feel their eyes on her, not just wary now, but uncertain, calculating. Some looked at her like she was a savior. Others, like she was the spark that would end them all. She thought of the prophecy, of the silver fire she'd let loose, of the way it had felt to stop hiding and simply be. That truth terrified her. Because if she could do it once, she could do it again. She met Kale's gaze. "Would you fear the fire, or let it set you free?" The words hung between them, heavier than the smoke in the air. And then, as if she were speaking not only to him but to every wolf watching, to everyone who would hear this story long after the flames had gone cold, she added, "If this story burned in your chest, subscribe to the Alpha's Romance Library, where passion and destiny collide." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain. The moon slid behind a cloud, dimming the world, and for just a heartbeat, the plateau was plunged into shadow. In that darkness, a single question remained. When the fire comes again, will they stand beside her, or stand in her way? The night did not end in silence. The air still hummed with the echo of her howl, the plateau still warm beneath her bare feet as though the stone itself remembered the fire she'd called down. Wolves lingered at the edges, some watching her as if she were a living omen, others keeping their heads bowed, unwilling, or unable, to meet her gaze. Kale stood beside her. Not in front, not behind, beside. The chain marks on his wrists were still red, and there was blood drying along the line of his jaw, but his posture was steady, his presence anchored. They didn't speak as they left the battlefield. The flames had burned a blackened path through the grass, a trail that led down from the mountain plateau into the forest below. She followed it without thinking, each step pulling her further from the torches, further from the accusing eyes, further from the war she had just begun without meaning to. The first hints of dawn were softening the edges of the world. The darkness thinned, and the trees ahead caught the faintest touch of gold. Kale's voice broke the quiet. "The packs will not forget what happened tonight." She didn't look at him. "I don't expect them to. They'll either rally to you," he said, "or they'll come for you harder than before." "And which do you think is more likely?" He was silent for a moment. "Both." A low wind moved through the trees, stirring the ash that still clung to her skin. She could taste the bitter tang of it on her tongue. They reached the tree line, where the forest opened into a ridge overlooking the valley. From here, the world stretched wide and endless, rivers like veins of silver, the distant peaks still draped in night. The sun was just breaking over the horizon. She stopped, watching the light bleed into the sky. For the first time since she'd shifted back, she felt the ache in her bones, the heaviness of her limbs. The power was still there, simmering under her skin, but it no longer screamed to be unleashed. Cale stepped up beside her. "You changed the moon tonight," he said quietly. "No one's done that in centuries." She almost smiled, but there was no joy in it. "Then the world is going to change with it." He looked at her then, silver eyes steady. "It already has." For a while, they just stood there, letting the light find them. The silence between them was not the silence of strangers, nor the comfortable quiet of allies, it was something more complicated, threaded with everything they hadn't said. The ground shifted under their feet. It was faint at first, just a tremor, the kind you might mistake for the settling of stone. But then it deepened, rolling through the ridge, rattling loose pebbles down the slope. Birds scattered from the trees in a sudden rush of wings. Alara's breath caught. Cale turned toward the forest below, his stance changing, his shoulders tightening as though bracing for something unseen. The tremor faded, but the air didn't settle. It thickened, charged with a pressure that had nothing to do with wind or earth. A voice slipped through the trees. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The sound coiled in the air like smoke, threading into her ears, her mind, until she couldn't tell if it was outside or inside her. "She is not the only one," her pulse stuttered. Cale's eyes snapped to hers, reading the recognition on her face before she could speak it aloud. "The flamebearers rise in threes." The last word hung there, drawn out like the strike of a blade, before dissolving into the hiss of the waking forest. They stood frozen in the growing light, the sun spilling over them, the warmth doing nothing to ease the chill the voice had left behind. And in that moment, Alara knew the battle on the plateau had been nothing more than a spark. The fire was still coming.